Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. My name is David,
And I'm Matt.
and together we are the Taylor Bros.
Yes,
This
we are.
is this is the Make It Count podcast, and we like to make it count. And Matt, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about risk, well, making risk count.
Mm,
Or, as the famous question goes, would you risk it for a chocolate biscuit?
yeah, that is the most important question. And stay tuned over the next 25 minutes, and we'll give you a definitive answer on that.
Or is it should you risk it for a chocolate biscuit? I don't know. The thing that struck me as I was looking at some of the stuff for this was the definition. I looked it up. I was like, oh, interesting. What is the definition? Every single definition was negative. So noun, like number one, the possibility of loss or injury, or like something or someone that suggests or creates a hazard. Number three, just the chance of a loss, the probability of a loss, or the chance that an investment will lose value. So to risk is to expose something to hazard or danger. Like, interesting. So it's all very negative in terms of it could just all go wrong. And at the end of the day, that's what risk is. It could go badly.
Mm-hmm.
So why are
Yeah,
we talking about that?
yeah, well, exactly, because I looked at some definitions. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but it was about this idea of exposure to danger. There's a risk of loss, there's a risk of danger.
Yeah.
And so uh, I suppose I've heard said from maybe many other people that, you've got to take risks. And I read a few articles and they were saying it's really good to take risks. And, you want your business to take risk and you want your teams to take risk and these sorts of things and anything. But the very definition is negative. So that was, and most of us have a negative association with risk. Oh, they've risked a lot there, but that's like dangerous, or like you said, exposing yourself and putting stuff on the line. And so maybe because the definition is negative, that's why we associate it with negativity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting because, again, like you do any research on this sort of thing and you get all these quotes and motivational quotes. And one that saw was the classic. It was a spin-off on a classic, and it was, better to have risked and lost than to never have risked at all.
Mm.
Right. And I kind of get it, and it's kind of funny, but it's also like, but actually that's exactly why people don't take risks, because we've been bitten in the past. So for example, I remember a time when, well, university, I had exactly that kind of mindset of that thing of, the things that you regret are not the things that you did. They're like the things that you never gave it a shot. So my third year project was fairly average. It was a fairly naff thing. So you kind of, at the beginning of the year, you'd put out a form like, these are the sort of areas I'm interested in, and maybe these are the professors that I would like to work with, and then you're allowed to sort of say a couple, like, I'm really not interested in that area at all, and I'd like to avoid that professor if possible. So I did that, and I got thermodynamics, which was fairly interesting. And I got this brilliant, I mean, she was absolutely brilliant professor, but a terrible like what was it, mentor, or she was not a very good at doing those mentory sort of things of helping, guiding you. She was just brilliant and completely mad, so she'd be jetting off to some conference, and herself, she kind of admitted that she would be kind of pulling an all-nighter to get her presentation together, and then just down in a couple of coffees and Red Bulls in the morning to have energy to do it. And everybody was like, that was amazing, and then she would kind of get on the plane and go home, sort of thing. So terrible example in terms of those things. So I got to the end of that project basically, and like, I want a different person, because she wasn't very supportive and she didn't really know that side of the skills. I felt quite unsupported, and also the project was not that interesting. So I decided I'm going to change, because I'd heard from a friend who was in the year above. He was like, yeah, my third year one was rubbish, but I changed and I got this really, really awesome like robotics one in my fourth year. Sort of mate, you should definitely, because he was then enjoying that. And I was like, yeah, definitely, I'm going to do this. Submitted an application to change, and they gave me the area that I didn't want, and basically a professor that I had been like really that interested. And so it was a risk, and I lost. I basically lost that one. I know, because my biggest so it's not, in a sense, it's not a regret of the decision, but my biggest regret of the whole degree was those two projects were just, they felt a bit damp and a bit like ugh, and they didn't go well, and I didn't enjoy them. The rest of my degree I loved, and so I made a risk, and it did go badly. I got the worst possible outcome, which was I got the area I didn't like and a group that wasn't committed, and the professor basically had these super high expectations because the group the year before had got like this amazing project, and we had to replicate their things, and nobody, it was like, so sometimes it doesn't go well,
So what
and
did you learn about risk then? Because you had a project that you were okay with, a lecturer or supporter advisor that was okay, but maybe not quite there, not quite the support. But you were like, hey, actually, there's a potential that I can do something I really love. So
yeah.
you went in, you applied to do it, and you ended up in the one area you really didn't want to do, with a team that you really didn't like, well, didn't feel committed with, and then with a lecturer that was no better, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I suppose, what did I learn? Well, that is the nature of risk. The risk is like it could go badly. There's a chance of loss or injury, or something could go badly. But the reason I risked was for the possibility of the reward of it going better. And so I think if I was in that same position again, like perfect hindsight, if I knew like that was definitely the outcome, I would have stayed put and been like, you know what, because the other guys that were in that group that I would have been in were much better, much more motivated. So I'm sure they had a much better time of it. So that I would have stuck then. But if I did it again and not knowing the outcome, I would say, no, yeah, go for it, twist. But maybe I would have advised to go and actually have a few more conversations with the people that were making those discussions and making those decisions, and just laid my point out a little bit clearer of like, I'm really, really, really interested in this stuff, and I'm really not interested in that stuff at all. And maybe that would have helped. But so that for me is highlighting, is one of the things that I read. They were talking about like exactly the same thing. You see all these articles about like, oh, make the risk, make the jump, do it, because otherwise it's, you're just going to stay safe and you're going to end up going into nowhere or whatever. But I quite liked this one that they're saying quite balanced. They were saying, yeah, make the jump, but don't make it a blind jump. You do your homework, do your preparation, and also like, are there things that you can set in place to minimize the risk ahead of time? Is there a safety net that you can put up? In some industries, engineering is the same. That you literally you take on professional liability or indemnity, which is effectively going, if it goes wrong, we're insured, it's not going to sink us. It's not then going, great, it's fine, we can just take ludicrous risks, but you're going, that's the safety net.
And I suppose that's the thing, is that most of us are maybe quite, well, we have a negativity bias. We're worried about what's going to go wrong. We're maybe by nature risk averse, or at least we think we are. Because I was wondering about this idea of things that we think are risky versus things that are actually risky that we don't realize are risky. What do you think about that as an idea?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting about that second definition, the noun of risk. It was like something or someone that creates or suggests a hazard. So, oh, that's really interesting. So, like, it doesn't even have to actually be a hazard, just suggest a hazard. And it's kind of that thing of what's it? They measure two things. It's kind of the real kind of the real crime rate in an area, and then like the perceived crime rate, or like how safe people feel. And so one of the things that goes into that is, for example, like street lights overnight, in the middle of the night sort of thing, when nobody's really driving around, and people feel a little bit less safe if there's a blackout in the night, like intentional, to save electricity or whatever, because nobody's using them. But there's no actual marked increase in any meaningful crime. There might be a slight increase in some loitering around, but that doesn't actually make any difference. So it's like, oh, that's really interesting how the perception isn't always accurate. So I can't think of another example off the top of my head of when I've experienced that, but I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because you see that sometimes with risk assessments, and I'm trying to think of the example, but basically there was somebody that came in and they were like, "Hey, you have to change all this," and it's like, "Well, this has never gone wrong ever. Like, it's not a real risk." Oh, but it might be a real risk at some point. It's like, well, it hasn't been, and there's no evidence of that. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't. Like, sometimes there's an appropriate reality to that. And I think this was something I was thinking about. I was reminded of a podcast I listened to by it's called Cautionary Tales, and they talked about this idea of what is risk, and obviously economists and health services and insurances all have to work out what is real risk, so they know how to insure for that, and they know how to look after people and what the value of different things are. And so they came up with this idea of like a micro mort, which effectively means a 1 in a million chance of death. And so all these different activities have a number of different, like, this is associated with this amount of risk. So for example, they were saying, say you had a friend that was going to come around for the weekend, and in order to come to your house, they had to drive 100 miles, which would be a 200-mile round trip. Well, they know a 200-mile trip has a 1 in a million chance of a fatal car accident.
Wow.
Would you say don't come? Well, most people would be like, oh, I'll go for it. That's a risk I'm willing to take. And so, but scuba diving has 5 morts, or it's like 5 in a million chance of death. And so all these different activities have different values. So it's just quite interesting that like someone has worked out what is actually risky versus what isn't for our lives. And that's how like all these things, insurances and things work out. And they basically, I think they said in the US, 1 micro mort is worth about $10. So a life is worth about 10 million or something like that.
Wow.
Bit weird, but yeah.
Gosh, yeah, very. There you go. Insurance. The insurance industry has answered one of those most meaningful questions: how valuable is life?
Yeah, it was quite interesting how they came to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It was actually quite fun. It was quite a funny story they told in the podcast of basically a guy that was like, it was in the US, and he was like, if we had to, this is many years ago, decades ago, if we had to like, what would be the most cost-effective way to like bomb Russia or USSR at the time? And he basically was like, basically make loads of planes, and there would be like hundreds, maybe thousands of decoys, and they would all just fly at the same time. And the chances would be that some like atomic bombs would get through. But they're basically like, that's a terrible idea. Like, imagine all of the pilots in like the decoys, and be like, is our life worth nothing? We're just like in a cheap, shoddily made plane. And they were like, so his thing of like cost effective, they were like, you haven't included the value of a life, which is clearly more than nothing.
Wow.
So it's just quite interesting.
That's so interesting. Yeah. And of course, when you get into that sort of question of, state warfare and statecraft and everything, it's like, there are definitely some cultures where, the value of your life is to sacrifice yourself for the cause, sort of thing, for the motherland or the father or whatever. So that's a little bit of a tangent on our conversation, I think.
Yeah, but to maybe bring it down in from like, the macro huge level, in reading different things about why we should take risk, I wasn't sure I came across very many compelling things ultimately. But there was one kids website that was like, you learn what you like and what you don't like by risking new things. You learn to make wiser decisions in the future by taking those risks. And I thought, that's really good. That's true for all of us. Like in all of the like blog posts about taking risks, nobody really answered why. And and even people were like, your teams, your business should take more risks. Well, and I thought in my head, well, why should they take more risks? And ultimately, is it safe to take more risks? If they cost your business money, and even if it was a right thinking, a right idea at the right time that didn't work, what's going to happen to that person? Is it ultimately safe to take that risk? Well, maybe not, but then also you're not really incentivizing it. And I sort of look back at my own life, and when have I taken risks of various kinds? And I think one of the things I remember was getting ready to do some time abroad as part of my university course. And I initially was going to go to Italy and Palermo, but then at the last minute, a new like link came up. The university had made a new connection with another university, and it was in Madrid. And I was like, well, of course I want to go to Madrid. But actually, it was a new link, so it's untested, and there were communication with that university was tough for the people that were supervising me, but also for me. I was trying to reach out to various people, nothing for a long time. And we weren't sure whether accommodation had been sorted out for me. We weren't sure if they were really even expecting me up until like a day or 2 days before I was going to go. I didn't know any Spanish really. I've been trying for like a few weeks. So I'm heading out into this place where it's like, I don't know the language. I don't know if anybody's expecting me. I don't know if I'm even going to have a room. I don't really know where I'm going. What am I doing? Like, I just felt
Yeah.
like a really big risk. And I'd been sponsored some money. So I knew from the moment I went out, I had to stay for a minimum of 3 months, or else I would have to give all of that money back out of my own pocket. So, it's like,
Wow.
oh, I'm like committed to being here for 3 months. Nobody can come find me, or they could, but it's expensive, all this. And I remember even being on the
Wow.
plane, I sat there and there's this elderly Spanish couple, and I tried to talk to them with my terrible Spanish, and I could just see this like pity and fear in their eyes for me, just going, yeah, this could be tough. Maybe I've read that into the situation, but I remember that moment of just looking at me like, it's gonna be tough for you. You said you're going to university, right? Yeah, you're like the level of a Spanish of like a 2-year-old. Anyway, um, and then I arrived, and for like a couple of weeks, it was really tough. I didn't connect with anybody, but now I've stayed in touch with a few people. And as I look back on it, yeah, I didn't thrive, but I survived. But
Mm.
from doing that, I felt like it kind of opened the world up to me a little bit, that, I could go somewhere and I could live. And I didn't know the language, but yeah, I was okay. I didn't die. It felt like a really big risk, but actually it grew me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I love that. I really love that. There's a couple of threads I'd like to pull on as you've told that story, and also the one before about kind of that kid's website. I think it nails it really nicely. Like you learn through taking risks. You learn what you like and what you don't like. And so, for example, the other week we had a wonderful Mother's Day curry as a family. You guys, came over and we took a takeout, and I was talking to Charlotte, and she was like, "Oh, well, what should we go for?" And I said, "Well, one of the things that I always like to do, especially if you're sharing, is you go for most of ones that you like, but then you always pick one, because there's a new one that you've never done before, because you might discover it's really nice. And if you discover you really don't like it, great, you've learned something for the future." And what I realized, just thinking about it through this lens of this conversation, was what that is doing is obviously it's taking a risk. It's a bit of an adventure, you're learning something. But in the context of, if you're picking multiple dishes to share, that risk is minimized because it's shared by everyone at the table. It's not like, right, I've picked this dish and that's it, that's my food, and if I hate it, I've got to eat it. It's like, no, if actually we all hate it, then we've got other food, but there's a good chance that someone will enjoy it, and so even if like everyone else doesn't like it, they can major, and so it's like, oh, that was really interesting, because inbuilt into that sort of the restaurant system of like, ordering an exciting dish is risk, but also a bit of risk management, and I quite liked that. But the other side of it, I was thinking about this, you were saying it's a lot of stuff that wasn't really that compelling, and we haven't really spoken about it much. Maybe in the last couple of minutes we could touch on it, but one of the things we've talked about a lot through many different episodes is some of the most important things in our life, relationships, right? And it felt like everything I was reading was all about business and career and everything, and I literally had to kind of go, well, how about in relationships, and searched a few things and found a couple of quotes, and it reminded me of the John Powell book, Why Am I Afraid to Love? Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am? But that recognition of the value of taking a risk is, one, like there's a real possibility of it going well and you get the reward. But the other side of it is exactly that. Like, if it doesn't go well, actually that's then an opportunity to grow through challenge, to grow through hardship, or even if it was a failure in business or something, or in a relationship, to grow through managing failure. It's like one of the worst things I think that can happen to us. I can't remember the quote exactly, but it's like one of the worst things that can happen to a young person is for them never to fail, because it's inevitable to happen at some point in their life. And if they've never learned how to deal with it when the stakes are low, and there's a safety net of you've got support net around you, parents, teachers, or whatever, then when it happens to you in your adult life, you could come absolutely crashing down, So I think that's the value of risk. And that's like one of the reasons why you even get some like places where there's kids playgrounds and stuff, where they're actually taking away some of those sort of the rubber bits and bobs, so that they go, actually, no, like we're encouraging the kids to jump and play and scrape their knees and stuff, because at the end of the day, a scraped knee is a very low risk. It hurts like a lot when you're a kid, but it's really good for you to learn. If you do that, you might scrape your knee, you might get hurt, and then you're more likely to put that into the filter for when you've got a bigger risk to take when you're a teenager or you're an adult.
Yeah, and I think the tendency for most of us, as we started, was to avoid risk. The alternative, though, isn't to blindly take risks. I think there's this stoic idea to like think on your death like daily, like think about the fact that you are going to die all the time. And I don't know if that's always helpful. I think it's something that will happen to all of us. Controversial idea, I know, but I wonder, when you're thinking about taking a risk, to contemplate what are the actual risks. If it does go wrong, what is the uncertainty here? What is the chance of failure? What does that look like? To actually contemplate those things beforehand, so that you're not blindly taking the risk, but you're going, hey, there's a chance that this happens. Like, what is that chance? And just to actually not just jump in and go, oh, well, I never thought this was going to happen. Well, actually, maybe if you'd contemplated it for a bit, you would. And maybe you'd contemplate it and go, well, there is a chance that this happens, but actually there's also a chance this really amazing thing happens, and I would love to see if that can happen. And there's loads of books about framing failure and fail forwards and things like that idea. So rarely is it actually a terminal thing, but yeah, I suppose sometimes it's knowing what to risk, when to risk, and yeah, our attitudes to that probably change as we get older. We become a bit more conservative, or when you have other people relying on you, like now I'm married, my decisions don't just affect me, they affect my wife. When you have children, they don't just affect you, they affect your wife and your children, or your husband or your spouse or whoever. These other people become reliant on you. And so I think that is interesting as well, to be like, well, I'm taking a risk, but it's not just for me. And so what does that look like? And people have different tendencies to that, but ultimately, like you said, and I think it is true, but it's done on some research and some interviews, is that most people regret the things they didn't do rather than the things they did and didn't do well. And I suppose as well, the tendency as well, or my encouragement, is to go, what is a real risk versus something that is a perceived risk? That it feels risky, or it feels deadly or life altering, but actually it's not a real risk. I mean, we know that flight travel is safer statistically than car travel, but most of us are not praying before we get in the car that we're going to be okay, and that we're not
as you're parking, I hope it goes well.
So that's an interesting thing, where our perception of something doesn't match up with the reality of it.
I like that. I think my closing thought would just be bringing it back to that relationship thing. And we've spoken a little bit, I don't know if we've spoken on a podcast, but we spoke recently about this idea of bids for connection. And so many times there are, people are making a bid for connection. And the link I want to make is also with the procrastination episode, we talked about, like, there are things that have deadlines, but there are some things in life that don't, and relationships just don't have those deadlines. They either just, you either make those bid connection and you step forward and you maybe take some risks in broaching difficult things or having some conversations that might be uncomfortable, or you don't and you default, and they can just drift, and they can drift apart or just drift alongside each other, but you're not actually nourishing and getting closer. And so like this quote here from this guy called Leo Buscaglia, who was a American professor, he might have been Italian American professor. He said, "To love is to risk not being loved in return. To hope is to risk pain. To try is to risk failure. But risks must be taken." And then he says his reason for risks being taken is the same, funnily enough, as Mark Zuckerberg's, because the greatest risk is to risk nothing. And that's not actually that necessarily that compelling, but I think imagine forward, do exactly what you said. Like, the perceived risk of taking action might be really big, and the perceived risk of not taking action or not having that hard conversation might be really small. But the real risk might be like, think about the future, think about 5 years, 10 years time. If I haven't had that tough conversation, am I likely to have the next one? Am I what's that likely to do?
Yeah, and that small thing today, if you keep doing it every day, it compounds. So it might feel like a really small risk, and making the active thing is a really big risk, but over time, being passive could be the biggest risk. So a load of thoughts there for you to mull over and contemplate and pick the bones out of. We appreciate you lending your ears to us for this last little bit of time for this episode. We hope you've enjoyed making it count with us this week. Until next week.
See you guys.